This is a culmination of a small idea that Chelsea had, and we originally were going to do more of a workshop style, and the committee saw our proposal and said, everybody needs to hear this, so that was really exciting. So this turned into a panel presentation that everybody gets to come to. There are several themes that we want to touch on this afternoon. The first is the overall relationship that social workers and allied professionals have with police officers and vice versa. We're going to refer to social workers and allied professionals in our discussion today because we recognize that there are people who are in the role of social worker that may not actually have that degree, but are in that, have that title. So I just want to put that out there. And I'm going to lose my place, of course. Okay, our panelists are going to talk about their own experiences from both the social work and law enforcement perspectives. So we have 2 social workers on the panel and 2 law enforcement officers. We're going to ask them to share their values and the perspectives that overlap, while also talking about ways that they differ. Social workers and law enforcement work together in a variety of ways, so our frame of reference from the Children's Issues Committee, we originally were thinking about this from the perspective of child protection, juvenile justice, domestic violence, and cases involving mental health concerns. But we want to make you aware that there's obviously so many ways that social workers and law enforcement officers overlap. So when it comes to time for discussion, questions, that kind of thing, please feel free to bring other perspectives. We also want to frame the conversation by understanding that both social workers and law enforcement are often first responders. So I heard this in a workshop earlier, somebody mentioned this comment of thinking of DCYF as first responders, but I just want to say that I think all social workers may be in that role at times as first responders, that you hear information that's really tough to hear, and law enforcement is also in that position, so I think that's a shared perspective that we can take together. So we're going to talk about how both of our professions address secondary and vicarious trauma. There's a couple programs we'll talk about. And hopefully that will spark you to think about ways to share resources in your own community to do the same.
Yeah. So like Becky said, my name's Chelsea, and I kind of got this idea because it was something that I wanted to learn about. I was thinking when I was working as a school social worker about how closely I worked with the school resource officer and how our jobs often aligned. And I think no matter what field of social work you're in, you're interacting with law enforcement officers. So so our second theme is how we can improve the partnerships between social workers, allied professionals, and law enforcement. And one goal we have for today is that you'll be able to hear stories that these 4 professionals have of working together and how they partnered well. And our hope is that you can kind of take their stories and then apply that to your own communities and think about how you can partner with law enforcement in your own specific fields. So we're coming at this from a strengths-based perspective and about what's working well. And part of that is I just want to acknowledge that this conversation can be controversial right now in our culture, talking about law enforcement and social work partnership, and we want to acknowledge that there could be a lot of emotions in the room when we're talking about that, and so I just wanted to name that. So part of the reason why we want to do this sort of like a fishbowl conversation is as an invitation to you for authenticity and vulnerability to have this conversation between different professions. And so you guys are all gathered around. You're going to hear these 4 professionals talk with each other about partnership, and then we're going to break off and let you guys have conversations at your table. There are some little table tents in the middle of your table that will have some questions for you during the break-off sessions, just to talk about your experiences. And then you'll also see a little stack of sticky notes. So when you walked in, you might have seen a little banner. So if you have any ideas about themes, questions, feelings, experiences, action steps that you can take in your community, we ask that you jot those down on the sticky note, and then when you get up to go to dinner or when you go up to leave tonight, you just stick that on the poster over there, and we're going to kind of compile all of those ideas together, and we'll send them out to all of the attendees at the conference, if that makes sense. So I'll just pass it back to Becky for the introductions.
All right, so I'm actually going to introduce each of the panelists first, and then I'll ask them to describe their programs. I was debating about which order to do this in, but we'll start with Ken down at the end. So a lot of you probably know Ken Norton as a social worker, obviously. He's the executive director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, called NAMI affectionately. He has developed and led training on suicide prevention and postvention in over 40 states and 5 countries. He works closely with the state police and individual police departments around the state. NAMI trains police departments in how to de-escalate individuals and be sensitive to someone in crisis. Ken has lived experience as a family member and a former foster parent, and he has a licensed clinical social worker. You'll get to say later more about that and give us more.
Becky was my CPSW.
I was his CPSW when he was a foster parent. So next to Ken is retired Lieutenant Nicole Ledoux. She served with the Manchester Police Department from 1995 to 2018, achieving the rank of lieutenant. And I'm sorry, I was trying to make all these equivalent lengths, and I apologize if they're not, but you're all equally important. From 2008 to 2018, Nicole was assigned to the investigative division of the Manchester PD, completing her services as the supervising lieutenant of the juvenile and domestic and sexual violence units. Lieutenant Ledoux has extensive training in the areas of child abuse and neglect, sexual assault, human trafficking, trauma, vicarious trauma, and investigative techniques. She was a founding member of the Manchester Police Department Critical Incident Management Peer-to-Peer Support Team, which we'll talk about a little bit today, which assists department members in dealing with trauma experienced in their work as first responders. And then the other program we're going to ask Nicole to talk about. In 2015, Nicole was as part of the Manchester PD, they started the Adverse Childhood Experiences Response Team. So I think that's a great program for people to hear about. It's designed to connect children who are exposed to traumatic events such as domestic violence, overdose, and criminal violence to appropriate mental health services to mitigate the effects of such exposure. She retired from the Manchester Police Department in September of 2018 and now works for the Granite State Children's Alliance as the Victim Services Quality Assurance Director. And she also is still involved with the peer-to-peer program through the Manchester PD. Next to her is Lieutenant Matthew Isham. He works for the Lebanon Police Department. He currently oversees the Operations Support Division. Over his 23-year career, he has served as the Department Prosecutor, Detective Division Commander, and Patrol Division Commander. He served on the Grafton County Mental Health Group, which developed a mental health court in the Lebanon District Court. It was during that time that Lieutenant Isham became aware of the CIT model, which we'll talk about today, also known as the Memphis model. He brought the training to the Lebanon Police Department and has helped other New Hampshire police departments to embrace it as well, and he is the lead for that in the Lebanon Police Department. And last but not least, we have Whitney Husong, who is a police social worker. So this was our big idea, police social worker. So we were very excited. She's from Vermont. So she's employed by Healthcare Rehabilitation Services, which there's flyers on your table. It's also referred to as HCRS. It's a community mental health center in the Upper Valley region, but on the Vermont side. She works side by side with law enforcement officers in Hartford, Vermont, to address issues that are related to mental health, child protection, domestic violence, elder abuse, substance abuse, critical incident stress debriefings, and much more. She is a certified crisis intervention team, that's that CIT acronym that I was saying, coordinator, that organizes the police department's training and outreach. She works closely with the Lebanon Police Department and introduced us to Lieutenant Isham, so that was wonderful. And previously, she worked as the Victim Services Case Manager for an agency in the Chicagoland area that was contracted with multiple police and fire departments for 24/7 crisis. So as you can tell, we have a really distinguished panel. They're really amazing. We're so excited. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass the mic around, and I'm going to ask them to go in order and tell us a little bit about their agency, so more than what I said, a little bit about the agency and the specific programs that I mentioned, and give us like 5 minutes about your program. We're going to start with Whitney.
Hi, everyone. So as Becky said, I'm actually employed through HCRS, so that's the Community Mental Health Agency, and I'm embedded full-time within the Hartford Police Department. So my coworkers are the police officers, and my office is within the police department instead of within the mental health agency. So I'm available to the officers to go out on calls. I respond with them to incidences where something might be a little bit more human service related than criminal. Even though I do get involved in some criminal cases, depending on what the need is. So I'm available to them also for a consult if they're looking for some advice on certain situations. And then I'm available, as Becky said, I help coordinate the CIT program for Hartford. We work very closely with Lieutenant Isham in their CIT program in Lebanon. And then available for trainings as well. We do some suicide prevention trainings and whatnot for the officers as well. And just available, I work on an on-call basis for the most part, so I'm there kind of 8 to 4 for the most part, and then I'm available on call for major incidences, so I can sometimes get called out to assist with families that are experiencing a major crisis. Or I might get called in to work with the fire police department to do a debriefing if they've gone to a major critical incident. So
Oh, good. Excellent. It's a long ride. Again, my name's Lieutenant Matthew Isham, Lebanon Police Department. As Becky mentioned, I started with the Grafton County Mental Health Team Group. And originally our goal was to start a mental health court in our local court to address some of the people that were coming through that ended up in court and probably could have used a lot more. Through that, we ended up going to a conference. And when I went to the conference, I met all kinds of police officers from across the country. And all I kept on hearing was CIT, CIT, CIT. So me being the investigator that I am, I said, what is CIT? And they started explaining to me. I'm like, that seems what we need. So for people that don't know, CIT is Crisis Intervention Team. What it is, it started in Memphis, Tennessee in 1989. There was a shooting of a mental health person by the police department. Of course, you could imagine there was an uproar. Why didn't we do more? What more can they do? And they decided to come up with this extensive training, more than what we'd ever get at the academy. So CIT is based on a 40-hour class over a week. And what it does, it brings in all kinds of professionals, mental health professionals, doctors, support people, family members, anything you can think of, any service that's available in the community that you can form a partnership or need to form a partnership comes together, and they teach us. They teach us about mental health. They teach us about the medications. They teach us about how to de-escalate, on top of what we've already done. And then you go out, and these officers that are trained are highlighted so that if we know, if I go to a call and I get there and I'm like, something wrong, I can call on one of these officers to come in, and then they can take over because they have that extra training to identify. The basis of CIT is to identify that someone's in a crisis, de-escalate them if they can, and then divert them. Because as police officers, mostly it's always been, what do we have to do? We could put you in jail, or we can bring you to the hospital, depending on where. We didn't have any other opportunities. We didn't know how to do that. So through the collaborations of the trainings, we were able to reach out and form these partnerships in the community so we know where to get people help. And when we learn about them, we can talk about them effectively to make them understand them and hopefully get those referrals.
I'm going to stand up. I want to just first say that you social work people know how to do this. This place is amazing, right? This is where you have conferences. I should have got into social work. We don't do it like this in law enforcement. It is too late. Well, you never know, right? So my name is Nicole Ledoux. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Manchester Police Department. Becky certainly ran down what I did there. So they asked me to come and talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Response Team. We call it ACERT. The ACER program came about in 2015. Really, myself, Paul Thompson, and Sean Layton were all in supervisory positions in the investigative division, and we were literally just talking about how we were responding to a lot of overdoses and domestic violence calls where kids were the ones calling us or kids were present. And we were leaving having solved the domestic violence issue for the minute, right? Because that's what law enforcement does, right? Come in, take someone out, it's over for a minute. Or we would bring the overdosing caregiver to the hospital, and we were leaving those kids behind with no service. Certainly, we were referring those children to DCYF, but this issue, certainly the opioid issue, has overwhelmed DCYF, right? They're a good organization, they do a great job, but they can only do so much with the people they have. And then we knew that for domestic violence cases that in Manchester, we have our own office of DCYF. We don't share them with anyone else. That they had one part-time person that was working doing domestic violence type cases. And we arrest about 2,000 people a year for domestic violence in the city, so that wasn't cutting it either. So we said, how are we going to get these kids services? Like, they need help. Right? And there's no at the time, no voluntary services with DCYF. Those had been eliminated. What can we do? So we connected with Manchester Community Health. They have a program called Project Launch, and we said, how can we do this? And this is what we came up with real quick. We created, over time, a team of responders that were trained in adverse childhood experiences, that were trained in childhood trauma, that were trained in how to deal with their own trauma, because when you go out and you see kids in that situation, that's traumatic. And we made teams of one law enforcement person with that training, one crisis advocate from the Y, because we had such a huge amount of domestic violence calls that we're responding to, and one case manager, social worker, clinical person, depending, from Manchester Community Health. And they go out after we've gone to some sort of traumatic incident at a house. They can either go out in real time right away, but what we found is that didn't work that great because people were still processing their trauma, and someone yapping at them was like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? Like, how am I gonna pay my bills? My husband's gone, and I get someone yapping at me about adverse childhood experiences. I'm not hearing it. What we found is we go out a couple of days later, and we speak with the non-offending caregiver and say, listen, what happened at your house? We can give you services through the Y if it's domestic violence, but what we really want to talk to you about is the fact that that trauma, even though you say your kid was sleeping, and we know they weren't, nobody stays asleep when there's a fight in their house, or even though you say your kid wasn't affected, they called because you overdosed, they were affected. We can help you get them into mental health treatment. We connected with mental health providers in the area that wanted to be involved and said, do you want to be referrals for us? Put them on a sheet, got a really good explanation of what everybody provides, and we sit down with parents and say, these are our organizations we can refer your kid to. We'll do it for you. Sign this release, we'll send the police report to that mental health agency, and they will contact you for an appointment. And so the mental health agency has an idea of why we're referring the kid because they have the police report in front of them. So they're not relying on caregiver information, which can be inaccurate because sometimes that's embarrassing and you don't want to tell. And they actually reach out to the parents. So we're removing that onus from them because they might be going through their own stuff, right, their own trauma. But we bring the crisis advocate from the Y also to say, if you need help, we want to help you too. That's the crux of the program. Since 2015, we've connected with about 1,000 kids in the city. Not to say that everyone has gone into service, but we've connected with about 1,000 kids.
Can you talk a little bit about the peer-to-peer program too?
Super quick. Super glad to hear they're doing it in Hartford too. So the peer-to-peer program started, it started after Mike Briggs got killed. We tried to start it after Mike Briggs got killed. There was some of us that were present when that happened that were significantly affected by that. It didn't take hold, our administration didn't buy into it, and then we had a couple years later a guy get shot 5 times and almost die. We brought it to the administration again, a new chief, and he was completely on board. And I said, you're bringing the Boston Police Department up to do critical incident debriefs and to do peer-to-peer, and as much as we respect them, they're not our peers. We don't work with them. They work in Boston. That's a totally different experience than Manchester, New Hampshire. So we went through the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, a group of us, and got training in critical incident debriefs. We connected with Dave Goldstein, who's a police chief and a clinician, and a couple of clinicians from the VA, because they kind of understood the trauma that we were having and they wanted to be involved. And we created a team of officers that are trained in critical incident debrief and peer-to-peer support. And we also, on that team, have several clinicians that, should we not be able to deal with what our peers are bringing to us, we can refer out. So that's it. I'm trying to be really fast.
Hi, Ken Norton from NAMI, New Hampshire, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And for those of you not familiar with NAMI, our mission is to improve the lives of all people impacted by mental illness. And we do that through support, education, and advocacy. And all people means all people. So law enforcement is often on the front line dealing with people with mental illness. And so we see that them as a key constituency for us to serve. And we serve them in all 3 of those areas. The largest being education. We train all cadets coming through the police academy in 16 hours, so 2 days of training in mental health training. And that training starts with the Mental Health 101, and then it's many of the things that the lieutenant said that are parts of what CIT is. So there's de-escalation, there's role plays. We bring in people with mental illness to talk about their experience and what it's like and what some of their interactions with law enforcement. We talk about suicide prevention and microphone. Yeah, I don't know what it's doing. What?
I turned this one on.
Okay. And about 10 years ago, we've always taught suicide prevention and suicide, how to deal with suicide by cop. but we started talking about suicide of cops 10 years ago, and that was pretty much unspoken prior to that time. So we also do CIT training. We have a new 3-year grant. We're doing that with state police, and we just completed one in Bethlehem 2 weeks ago. And we do suicide prevention training. Our Connect Suicide Prevention Program is trained around the country, and we deal with a lot of law enforcement through that. We also do mental health first aid. We do in our own voice presentations, which is people with mental illness talking about their recovery. And we provide support via consultation to different police. So we provide a lot of support to the peer support program at state police and assisting them with different situations that they have, or helping them prepare trainings, or helping them deal with situations involving family members, not necessarily law enforcement themselves. And we also provide support and consultation sometimes relative to the development of policies, or helping them to review policies when they want to send them by us. And then the last thing is that we do advocacy, and we're often involved in advocacy efforts at the legislature with law enforcement. A couple bills this session, one was to study the incidence of suicide in law enforcement and first responders. That one has been retained, but another bill relative to making a presumption for trauma in workers' compensation cases, so that people have a lesser threshold in terms of what they have to prove. So that's an overview of what we do.
I'm just going to project, if that's okay. I'll try to project very loudly. Here we go. But maybe you guys can just talk a little bit about what it's like working in a model where you're partnering social workers with law enforcement, and how working in a model like ACERT or CIT or some of the programs that NAMI does, how those have kind of contributed to your work. I don't know who wants to jump in on that.
I think, especially with CIT, CIT really helped to expand our resources, so to say. I mean, we have all these partners come in to present to our law enforcement, and that's a face-to-face for that officer to get to know somebody from that agency, so that when we're dealing with somebody who's either having a mental health crisis or is homeless and we're trying to get them connected to services or something, they can go straight to that agency and be like, hey, I know this person, and they can already start to have that conversation in that common language of, you know, we're dealing with this individual, these are the challenges that we're facing with this person, what can your agency do to help assist? So we're trying to obviously get that person, like Matt said, you know, you're trying to get that person into some place that can get them the services. We're not necessarily the ones that help hold the services, but we can help get them to that place that is able to provide that. So I would say that CIT has been a huge thing in terms of building partnership and community within, well, for me, within Hartford, so that we've got places that we can go when we need the help.
Yeah, collaboration. I mean, we work together. We're all doing the same thing. We're trying to give services to people. We're there. We see things that people don't see. So see that, if we know where to get them or who to reach out to, we can get them that help they may need, or we can get a service into them. And as Whitney said, it's making those partnerships so that we can collaborate to provide the best services to the community members. It's nice to be able to put that face to each other so you can call. I've done it many times, and there's always the privacy, but a lot of things that we have, it's not private. So I can call and say, hey, don't need you to say a word, just listen to me. And I know they're a patient at the community health. And I just say, hey, you know, this is what we dealt with. I don't, you know, probably could use some help, and boom, it's gone. And then the person on the line is like, they can go do their thing, and they reach out to that person, they find them, maybe they're not doing their meds, maybe they're out of meds, and they get them back into that service. And it's benefited us because we don't have to go and handle the same call over and over. It's reducing those amount of times that we have to go and service that person or have contact with that person just because they needed help.
ACERT, I think, because you're actually going out and you're standing next to people that are doing social work, that collaboration has made the law enforcement people have a better understanding and maybe more of a respect for what social workers do, and the inverse as well, because you're together. And so people, the social workers see how people interact with law enforcement, which is much different than how people interact with them, and vice versa. So that's been good. And I think that the collaboration, the face-to-face is so important. Like you can say, so I'm just gonna use Manchester references, but, oh man, we have to call Manchester Mental Health. They're not gonna do anything, which is not true. Or you can say, oh, I'm gonna call Sally at Manchester Mental Health, and I know her, and I've dealt with her, and we have CIT as well. We've worked CIT together. And so I feel comfortable calling her. And those like interpersonal relationships that have grown through ACERT between the officers and the Y, the officers in Manchester Community Health, we have CIT, so through the officers and our mental health agency, Manchester Mental Health, have just really changed the way we do business together. And police officers say, well, I'm not a social worker. You kind of are, right? Because people call us to solve problems that have zero to do with criminal law every single day. My kid won't go to school. My 12-year-old's misbehaving. My husband is having a mental health issue. He's not taking his medication. Those are not criminal justice issues. But when people don't know what to do, they call the police for help. So we are, in a way, not long-term intensive case managing type of social workers, but we're called to deal with societal issues every single day. And so being able to educate people, as we have through the ACER program, on trauma, childhood trauma, ACEs, vicarious trauma, mitigating your own trauma, they use that in their work on the ACERT teams, but they also use that in their work every day when they're in patrol responding to calls, or when they're working in investigations. So it's been really good to kind of teach them, like, even though you're a law enforcement officer, you'd have a social worker type of role that you have to embrace.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. One of the great things working about law enforcement, once you sort of break down that barrier and you get the relationships going, is that they're incredibly fun and have, just a great sense of humor. And so there's a lot of razzing that goes back and forth. And so they'll say, oh, you're a social worker, you bleeding heart, and I'm like, hey, you're a social worker with a badge, it's like, and so it's just, that give and take back and forth, which is really important. And that builds trust. And I think, as Nicole says, then, you have a face to a name, and you can go from there. One of the things that I would say and have said many times is that over the course of my career, I started training law enforcement when I worked at Lakes Region Mental Health in the mid-1980s. And I think the biggest culture change that I've seen in mental health over the last 3 decades is the attitudes and the knowledge of law enforcement relative to mental health, and it's been significant. And part of that change has been the recognition of their own vulnerability and their own mental health, and our ability as social workers to cross that bridge and to acknowledge that with them, and to validate that, and to assist. And part of that has come from, I think, our recognition and some of the shifting attitudes that we've had to our veterans. And obviously there's a huge overlap between the veteran population and the law enforcement population. But I think that that's been significant. And that, really results in much better care and outcomes for people with mental illness. Just that understanding and that compassion floats all boats. So I think all of that is really key.
So you guys talked about co-training. You talked about building relationships. Are there any examples, I don't want to stay too long on this topic, but are there any examples of bumps in the road with building those relationships that you want to share, like things not to do in other communities?
Here's the key. Always back your car in. That's the key to law enforcement culture. Don't pull head in, back your car in, and everything, they'll get it. Cause you gotta, am I right? So that's the first secret. Yeah, there's always bumps in the road, and I laugh when Matt was saying, when the call comes in and it's like, or I call and it's like, I don't need to say who it is. For years, and this was back in the 80s and 90s, it was like, first thing we would say in training is, don't call and say, do you know so-and-so? Because then the conversation just sort of stops. It's like, just call and say, we have this person down here who's like, doing X, Y, and Z, and, could you give us a hand? But if it's, do you know John Doe? I can't say if I know John or not, So, I mean, some of those things, and I think that when, certainly, and this is reflecting back on several decades of changes with the whole process of deinstitutionalization and the failures in many ways of our ability as a state to care for people with serious mental illness and how that fell to law enforcement created some real trust issues about where the boundaries were and who was supposed to do what. And probably looking back, we probably looked to have some people prosecuted for things that they never should have been going through the criminal justice system for. And law enforcement was very frustrated with us sometimes when they felt that we should have been hospitalizing somebody that we didn't feel really met the criteria. So, I mean, I think that this is where the education piece really becomes key to overcoming those bumps in the road.
If I step away from mental illness and just talk about like the social work, the CPSWs from DCYF, so I spent the majority of the second half of my career working in the division that works every single day with DCYF and the CPSWs. Are there bumps in the road? They continue, right? There's always going to be bumps in the road because you're very much on the same road, but you're in different lanes. And the goal of the criminal justice system and law enforcement is different than the goal of the CPSW or DCYF. But what is important is you gotta, what we try to do is to recognize what those bumps are and say, how can we work together to kind of smooth that over? And it's not always perfect, and we certainly still bump into each other on cases, and you're like, I really need that information, and they're like, we're not giving it to you, or vice versa, we're like, we're not giving it to you. And so try to find ways to get around it and recognize that although you're in different lanes on the same road, ultimately your outcome is always going to be, what you want the outcome to be is going to be the same. You want the best for the kid or whoever the victim is that you're dealing with. And if you get the best for the kid, you got to realize in law enforcement that if you have a victim, if you can help them become healthy, they're going to help you in your case better than if they're not healthy, right? And you have to realize that same thing in social work. Like, I understand that law enforcement doesn't want to give me this information because I then have to turn it over to the offender. So how can I work with them and we can get it in a different way? Like, so you just have to recognize that you have the same goal at the end, so you have to try to work together. It doesn't always go smooth.
Yeah, I mean, it is, that's what Nicole said, what Ken said, it's just, they're gonna be there. I guess one I always had right in the beginning was, well, HIPAA, and we're like, okay, but HIPAA, there's an exception when you need to tell us stuff, or there's ways we can go around this, and it was just educating each other about our roles and what laws we had to follow. And once we came to those understandings, it was much smoother. But it happens, but you know, okay, I'm at a dead end. They can't give me any more. How can I get it? And a lot of time, the person will tell you that they have a counselor. They'll tell you where they go. They'll tell you what medication. I mean, they want to talk. They're going to tell you everything. That's free information for me. I'm not asking them. They're telling me. So that's. But yeah, have to recognize and, like Nicole said, work around them or work through them.
I would say, just to be really short about it, is just any relationship takes work. So any partnership that you have, you just got to continue to work at it. Come to the table, come together. What's working, what's not working? How can you work around it?
That makes me think about funding.
So we do have some questions about funding, because I think that becomes a barrier for both sides. And so I want you guys to speak to, like, what do you do? How are you funded? How do you manage the issue of people's time and paying for time? Because I think people are curious about that. Like, when you think about partnerships and building collaborations, especially from the social work side, we think about how are you going to pay for people's time. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So my program through HCRS is funded mostly by grants. They're state grants, so they're state specific to Vermont. There's 2 grants that mostly fund us. One is a grant through our Department of Mental Health that really looks at trying to keep people out of the hospital as much as possible and in the community. So that's our biggest grant. We have a grant that we work through some drug money that helps pay when we're working with people that are dealing with some substance abuse issues. And then a very, very small amount comes from billing. So if somebody is a current HCRS client and they're open to our agency, already seeing somebody, already has a case manager, already has a counselor, something like that, then I can, if I have an interaction with them, I can bill for that service. But if it's somebody that has absolutely no connection to our agency and I'm still working with them, they're not open to our agency only through me, I don't bill for that service. So that's where most of our funding comes from, the grants. In terms of our CIT program, just really quickly, it's mostly, we don't pay our instructors, they all come, they're more than willing to come and teach our classes, so the cost is pretty minimum. We have some like binders and some food that we provide, so it's pretty minimal, but we have a close partnership with our public health council that helps fund the little bit of money that we need to put that on, so.
A lot of begging, pleading, donuts, coffee, because when I started the program in 2013, I would call everybody. I was calling DHMC, I was calling West Central, and saying, this is what I need. I have the information. Just take it and make it your own and give it back to me. So everybody's a volunteer. In all the classes that I've done, I've only paid 1 presenter. And that's another story, but I won't tell you where we're from, because it was not a good presentation, and I think everybody across the room was not happy with him. So it's all volunteers, making those partnerships and trying to make people understand why it's a benefit to them to help us. And I've never had people say no.
The ACERT program is funded, well, originally was funded by a grant from, and I think they changed names, but the H&H Foundation, Gail Garso, they've changed from H&H, right, to something else. I can't remember, but they gave us a 3-year grant to fund the overtime for the law enforcement people, the YWCA crisis workers, and the folks from community health. And then just before I left, we applied for a federal grant that was from the BJA, I think, that was focusing on how the opioid crisis was affecting children. And so we kind of focused a little bit on more on the opioids and a little bit less on the domestic violence part in the grant, but we still included the kids that were victims. And we'll serve any kid that's a victim of any trauma. So if a kid's a witness to a stabbing that's not domestic violence related or opioid related, we'll still go out for that. If we do a SWAT raid at a house, we'll go out and deal with those kids later. Actually, the chief will say, we're doing a raid, have people prepared to go out after and deal with those kids. And they got that grant right after I left, and that's a significant grant. I think it's close to $1 million, but we brought in that grant also now fire and EMS, because how we were finding the kids we needed was from police response, right? Well, fire response to all kinds of stuff that we don't go to in the city that kids are at, and certainly EMS. So we brought them into the program as well. So they're growing that program quite a bit. The police department paid for an AmeriCorps Vista to be the person who kind of organized the whole program from the inside. That's been rolled into the grant now, so everything is grant funded now, 100% federal grant funded now. But the first 3 years, it was money from New Hampshire, from the H&H Foundation. We said, hey, this sounds like a good idea, don't you think? And they said, sure does, good luck, here's some money.
And I'll put a plug in that there is, I think it's active, an RFP for more ACER teams around the state.
Oh, yeah, there's quite a few municipalities that have. The last 6 months of my career, it was like the traveling ACERT roadshow. I did so many presentations on it, which was good, and I was proud to do them. And so I believe Concord is looking into doing it. The Lakes region is looking into it. Keene reached out to us. Several places in Massachusetts. And we had a group from actually Wales, from the UK, come over and talk to us about our program. So yeah, there's a lot of New Hampshire communities that are interested. It's going to look different than it does in the city. because every community is different, but yes.
It's a challenge. And it's a big challenge, and one of the things that we've seen is that it's a challenge for law enforcement, that, that a lot of times when we have training that's available, for them to send somebody to a training means that person is offline, and that, they're having to pay somebody perhaps overtime to cover for that, or for smaller departments where, they don't have that capacity, they just can't come to training. And so that's a real big part of it. And I think for any type of program like that, it's always, I don't want to say easy, but easier to get the seed money to start something than it is to sustain it long term. And so that's certainly a challenge. And I think that there's a lot of other things that we would like to be doing with law enforcement if we had more money to support that. One thing is that about half of, depending on the statistic, but about half of the officer-involved shootings in the U.S. involve people with mental illness. And that's not really reported very much, but a huge tragedy for everybody involved, obviously for the person that's shot, for their family, for the officer that's involved, all those things. And likewise with domestic violence, more officers are injured responding to domestic violence calls than any other type of situation. So there's a lot of hazards out there for law enforcement and for us in terms of assisting them and helping to educate so that we can avoid those situations.
So we talked a little bit about bumps in the road or things like that, and then I loved the example that you gave, kind of saying they say social workers have a bleeding heart, and we say you're a social worker with a badge. But anyway, so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what sort of aspects of social work culture and then law enforcement culture actually align and are similar.
I would say that for the most part, I think everybody's out to help people. I think if you were to ask either profession why they got into it, that would most likely be the answer that you would hear most repetitively, is that I got into it to help people.
Yeah, I don't know what else there is. You see people at their worst, and it tugs on you. You want to make a difference. That's why I became a police officer. I want to make a difference. I think in social work, as Ken said, we are social workers. We don't do the jobs you guys do, but we're right there with you. And so the difference is, I don't know, there's things you guys do, there's things we do. And we have only, like Cole said, we have to go by the criminal. That's what we enforce, that's what we do. So we're often not as knowledgeable in the other side, the touchy-feely side, as Ken would put it. But what I can tell you that what I've learned from CIT and from working with social workers, working with mental health, working with domestic violence, compassion and empathy, and those are huge. And I can see that in some of the officers that come through the program by the end, because we do role playing, and I sit there and I go, wow, that guy actually has a little empathy. He can have a little compassion. I've never seen that from him before. So that's my take.
They saw my answers. I was going to say help people too, which is so corny, right? People say, why did you go to law enforcement? Because I want to help people, right? People roll their eyes, but it is true. You want to help people, but I think we're also very similar in, we're pretty resilient people, law enforcement and social workers. Like, we do see a lot of really nasty stuff, and we seem, although we need to take care of our mental health, I want to say that, and we don't do a great job of that sometimes, but in general, we're pretty resilient people, and we're able to manage, very quickly respond to bad situations and manage them. And so we're similar in that way, right? Think of the level 1 from DCYF or the code 3 call from law enforcement. They're the same thing. You're going out there like, this is bad and I have to fix it. And so you've very similar personalities. Although I think social work people, I think you're nicer to each other than we are in law enforcement. We're not always nice to each other. And you're also, And we're getting there, but I think that the social workers I deal with are more in tune with caring for themselves and caring for the collective and making sure that everybody's okay, you know, and law enforcement is getting there, we're working on it, but there's still a lot of that just suck it up mentality that needs to go away so that the issues that Ken has discussed in law enforcement go away.
Yeah, ditto with a lot of that. I think that, you know, one of the things that that where there's a perceived difference sometimes is relative to accountability, and that's where that sort of stereotypical perceiving us as social workers as bleeding heart type people, when in reality, for many of us, depending on the jobs that we're doing, we're really having to hold people accountable. And particularly in those roles where we overlap with law enforcement. So domestic violence and child protection and mental health, a lot of those times there is that level of accountability. We're held to our code of ethics and we operate under our code of ethics, and law enforcement operates under a criminal code and to uphold the Constitution. So there's some similarities in terms of sort of having this greater authority or code that we adhere to. And I think, you know, certainly as has been mentioned, the passion and dedication on both sides is just phenomenal. And as I had said before, the humor and tapping into that humor, which is a big part of the social work profession as well. So, yeah.
A couple of you mentioned something that leads me to think about secondary trauma, even primary trauma. Can you talk about how each of your professions handles that and maybe how we could work together to handle vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, direct trauma? We all experience it.
We don't in Lebanon. We struggle. We've identified that, and that's one thing we're working on. We train to go out. We train people how to protect other people, how to take someone's lives, and then we stop. We don't do anything more. So we're getting ready to start a program to try to do the rest of that. Then what do we do? How do we do it? Manchester's way ahead of us, only because it's a city. I mean, we're a city, but we're north, and knock on wood, we haven't had some of the, you know, the bad stuff that's happening down there. But that's one area that we're failing everybody in. We know we're doing it. When we can identify it, you know, we get those people help. We try to get them referred, but that's one area our next goal is to start working on all of that.
I would agree with Matt. I would say that is a big struggle that I've seen across the board with the law enforcement that I've worked with. It's a challenge. I get a lot of comments. You know, Ken said the bleeding heart. I get called the Care Bear a lot. So it's just kind of, it's a hippy-dippy thing to talk about our feelings, and we're not going to do it. And it's like, okay, you know. But you can call me at 3 a.m. when you're feeling bad. So it's a challenge for sure. To put a plug in just for kind of like myself, I think something that I also struggle that I've seen sometimes too is I think sometimes the officers forget that I too can be affected. So I'm in the car with you, I'm responding to the same call. We might not see the same things. You might be going in the house and dealing with like the blood and guts and stuff, and I'm out with the family, but that call too affected me. So, you know, I'm being asked to support the officers, and I'm totally fine with that. But sometimes I have had to say, like, look, I can't do the debrief on this one. Like, I too was involved in this, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. And so we'll have a different team come in and do it. But sometimes that piece I feel like gets forgotten a little bit.
Matt's right. We don't do a great job taking care of our own mental health. We certainly don't include our social service agencies that we work with. I've done quite a few debriefs for child homicides that my guys, I've been in them. I didn't do them. My guys and gals have worked on, and we've never included the CPSWs in those debriefs. And that you just made me, like, I'm thinking about that, going, maybe we should change that. The thing is, that the difficult thing with law enforcement is we are, we're very private. We don't like to, and I don't know why we're like this, but we don't like to let people in. We don't easily let people in our house, right? I mean, am I wrong?
Once you're there,
You're in. Once you're in, right? She's in. But it was hard, right? It wasn't easy. We're very private. Even if you're like out with us socially, if there's a group of law enforcement people and someone comes over that's not, it's like, the record stops, you know? And we have to do better about that and recognize that the people that we are working with every day, the CPSWs, the people on the CIT teams, if they're going in those houses with us, or if they're dealing with those families, they're exposed to the same trauma. Our CIT and peer-to-peer support teams are 100% voluntary, and nobody gets paid to do them. We also travel out, so if you ever need us, we go all over to do debriefs wherever, whatever law enforcement needs. But, so we are getting better, and our peer-to-peer unit is helping. Our chiefs, both the past one and the one now, have said that our civilian complaints against officers have gone down since we've had peer-to-peer, and our incidents of officers being involved in their own domestic incidents in their own homes, which is problematic, right? It has gone down significantly. As a matter of fact, we haven't had one since our peer-to-peer team has taken off. So it is helping. Getting guys and gals to buy in has been difficult. But as they see, if you get them to a debrief and they see that it works, or they hear that it was helpful, then they'll come, So it's going to be a slow process, but we're going to get there. And you're making me think that you're right. We should include, if someone's working side by side with us, we should include them in that process.
Well, my bride was a career prosecutor and became the first woman to serve a term as county attorney in the state. So I get welcomed into the house from the back door, which was helpful. But I guess with the gray hair or the few hairs that I have left on my head, that we haven't done so great as social workers either. I mean, I've lost 4 colleagues to suicide over the course of my career. I'm somebody that's had thoughts of suicide my entire adult life, and until pretty recently, never really talked about that. And I don't think we do very well as a profession with that. And I think to that extent, we share that with law enforcement, because in part, where do we go when we need help? Where do they go when they need help? If they want to maybe have a problem with alcohol or drugs and they want to go to a 12-step program, they're going to go downtown. If they need inpatient care, where are they going to go? There is an inpatient unit at McLean Hospital that's for first responders, and a lot of folks are going there now. But that's a relatively new resource. But where do we go as social workers? And we have our reputations, as we heard this morning at the keynote, to think about, or to how we perceive that. So, I mean, I would also say, looking back, that that I had a client who was on a 48-hour pass from New Hampshire Hospital, who jumped off a building and was severely injured. And I was the liaison to the hospital, happened to be at the hospital or on my way back when that happened. I was on call that night. No one said, hey, I don't think you should be on call. So he's in the emergency room being worked on. I'm called into the emergency room to deal with somebody else, and I didn't have the wherewithal to say, yeah, I don't think I should be on call tonight. So I think we, for both professions, need to do a better job with recognizing trauma and the impact of trauma, whether it's primary or secondary or whatever, and or cumulative or single incidents, and to think about what resources we can provide for each other and or for law enforcement or for other folks where it's difficult to ask for help. Had a conversation about this last night with somebody in the medical profession, and the suicide rates there and their inability to ask for help. So big issues.
And NHPR just did, I think on the exchange, they just did a news story about this exact issue, like where do first responders go for treatment, because there's so much more stigma from that point of view of where do I go, what's going to happen in my relationships with people in the community. So thank you guys for talking about that. We don't have good answers for it, unfortunately, but think what it speaks to is, from the social work side, having more professional, mental health professionals who are willing to see first responders, have the training to see first responders, and can make their environment more friendly to first responders, whether that's law enforcement or social workers.
And I'll just say, as an advocate, I advocated with NPR for a year to get them to do that show. And it worked, and it was great, so, yeah.
So the other piece to jump off of that, social workers and law enforcement both experience negative media portrayals, so we're going to get back to positive. But how can the relationships that we build together combat that strain, and how can we help each other when there's negative portrayals in the media? And have any of you addressed this in your own communities or in the relationships that you have with each other?
So I'll talk about this. It's a little dirty laundry, right? So my agency had some significant bumps in the road with DCYF within the, not within the last couple of years, maybe 3-4 years ago. And there was definite media stuff that came out of my agency that was negative about DCYF. And the one thing that I said when that happened was, that's fine if we feel this way, that's fine, but we can't just talk about it. Now we have to say to them, we're going to work with you to be part of whatever the solution is here, right? Like, if there's going to be negative press, and it's going to come from us, and some of it did come from my agency, we got to be part of the solution. Don't complain if you're not going to help, right? And so for me, I said, I want to, when they had their review, and now they're having their, interagency team that's working towards transformation. I said, I want to be part of this. Like, my chief, no longer chief, called you guys out in the union leader. That's fine if that's what he wants to do, but let's fix it. Let's work together to fix it. So I think if also, I will often say to people when they say negative things, I will say, listen, you don't understand the whole process. They have time frames they have to work in. You have to educate people about the agencies you're working with if people have negative connotations about what they do, because people often think negative things because they're not educated about what law enforcement does or what DCYF does. So if I hear negative things about the social workers, I say, you just don't understand the process. You think they're not doing anything. They're doing something, but they have rules they have to follow. They can't just do whatever they want. They can't just take kids out of homes and put people, forever in foster care. There's issues that surround all of that. So you have to be an advocate for the people that you're working next to.
Just stand together when you're working. If you're gonna, and be, like Nicole said, be part of it. Stand up, and don't be afraid to stand up for each other. We don't, unfortunately, in Lebanon, we're pretty, haven't had any issues. I know there's always complaints, oh, they didn't do that. But again, it's if you don't understand what's going on, it's hard to, you shouldn't be judging people on that.
One thing first, in terms of a positive thing, was we were involved in a thing called New Hampshire Blue and You that took place through the Carsey Center at UNH, which was these community forums or listening sessions where they were very structured to, the original idea, I think, came from relative to minorities and refugees, but it was expanded into other areas where there were 4 or 5 of these events held around the state where people broke into small groups, and then there were sort of questions that were posed, and there was a lot of dialogue, and it was a really positive thing. And so I think that can be really helpful. And I think that, as Matt said, I mean, you have to have those relationships and establish those relationships first, so that when the bumps in the road do come, you can get past them. There was a bill this session about deadly force, and it was kind of a quirky bill and brought by a sponsor that wasn't, didn't have a strong backing in the legislature, but that was a real difficult bill for us because we're doing education for law enforcement and we're working very closely with law enforcement, and yet the use of deadly force is a very difficult issue when it comes to people with mental illness. And so how do we walk that line relative to what our positions are on that and not damage those relationships? And part of that is to make the calls ahead of time and to say, here's where we're going to be, this is what we're going to say, and to have that dialogue take place behind closed doors first, so that when it's happening in public, it doesn't result in whatever, and you can try to find some alignment. But it certainly can be challenging.
So we're going to wrap up and let you guys break off in a second, but I'm just going to ask one last question to the panelists. So if a social worker or an organization doesn't have a relationship with a law enforcement agency or officer or anything like that, how do you suggest that they go about building that?
One of the first things I would say is invite someone onto your board. And if you're, from part of an organization, and the other suggestion that I would have is to offer to do some training for law enforcement. And the third suggestion would be to call the chief or the community outreach person or somebody to introduce yourself and invite them to your organization.
What he said, because those are all awesome ideas, that's what I would suggest too. And I would also say, ask if you can go on a ride along. Ask if you can say, I'm doing social work and I want to better understand your role. And then after your ride along, say, hey, why don't you come with us? And so you can better understand my role. Because once that happens, people, if you don't understand the agencies that you're working with, you can't work together. You have to understand their limits and what they can provide for you too, so you don't have unrealistic expectations, right? So, go on a ride along, call up, ride around with someone, see how law enforcement is, and then invite them to your house as well.
She took my thunder. Yeah, right along. But do it. I would, from experience, do it more than once, because the first time you're a stranger, and as Nicole said, we don't let people in. But if you get in there and you start to work, you go back again, and if you get with the same officer, they're going to start to accept you more, and you'll see more. But definitely, and all the other stuff Ken said, invite an officer to your place. We love lunch. Or just go up and talk to them, and reach out to whoever.
All my answers have been stolen, so.
Awesome. Well, let's just give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much, guys.